and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. I'm Tori, and this is my best friend Holland.
Hello.
If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allowed for our personal taste. We'll break down everything as we go, so feel free to agree, disagree, or just learn about something new. And be sure to tread lightly because there will be hot takes and spoilers ahead. Cut to the intro. Okay, so today I chose a book. I chose On Wings of Ash and Dust by Brittany Wang for us to review. This was familiar to me and blind to Holland in prepping for this. This is a book that I read, as of this recording, I read it for the first time about a year ago, I guess a little less than a year ago, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to tackle today. So here's some spoiler-free background to talk about before we get into things. So, On Wings of Ash and Dust is a collection of 6 mini novels that are written by Brittany Wang, and those mini novels were then put into one volume called On Wings of Ash and Dust. So this is all 6 of the mini novels in one. So the first mini novel was published August 3rd, 2021, and the collection published as one novel happened on November 30th, 2022. Less space in between those things than I thought. Yeah. To have 6 mini novels published in basically a year, and then the collection just a little bit after that. So I thought that was a pretty quick turnaround, personally. The synopsis from Goodreads, because there is not yet a Wikipedia page or anything like that, says this.
Tori loves Goodreads.
I do. I use it all the time. I have the app on my phone. Pixie Pirate Quinn may be an outlaw, wanted by all 5 fairy clans, but she prefers it that way. All she wants is to finally become a captain and bury her true identity beneath the rolling waves. But when the sudden death of her twin brother causes her to plot a vengeful heist, a shocking betrayal unmasks her for who she really is, her people's last living heir. Her only hope of escaping certain death for her crimes is taking her brother's place in the Ethodyne, a dangerous competition for the fairy crown. In a series of death-defying trials, Quinn faces off with the heirs of 4 rival clans: a mute beast tamer, a flirtatious merman, a half-blind artist, and a pompous princess. But as dark secrets unravel and an ancient prophecy entwines their fates, rivals must become allies before there's no world left to rule. So that's the synopsis from Goodreads.
I feel like that's on the back of the book as well.
Maybe it is. Oh, it sure is. It's the back of the book as well. I didn't realize that. Yeah. So, yes, I just read you the back of the book. All right. So with that being said, Holland, do you want to go ahead and kick us off into our first category?
Sure. No problem. So we haven't done a book in a while.
All the wrong questions.
That haven't been all the wrong questions.
That hasn't been all the wrong questions.
I feel like those have been the only books we've really... Well, we did Percy Jackson in season 1.
And A Monster Calls was in last season.
Yep, season 2. So... Books are a lot harder for us to get through.
They take a lot more prep time. That's why.
Specifically. So we'd like to do more books. So if you have books you would like to recommend for us, please go ahead and review those. Or
this might be the chunkiest one that we've done.
Yeah, I think so.
This one's like 500 pages. Maybe if you're going to recommend a book, less pages than that.
Yeah, or give us a lot of notice.
Yeah. We'll get to it in 2 years.
Yeah. Sadly. Yeah. Okay, so our first category for books is plot, story delivery, and world building. So total possible score of 3. I gave this 1.5 points out of 3.
Okay.
So overall, I think what really carries this category is the world building. The plot, I think, has a lot of not really like, I guess hang-ups would be the best way to put it. There's, in reading through the whole volume, I think that if you were to read these as individual novellas, like serially as they came out, maybe it would be different in how I kind of perceived the plot or how fluid everything felt. But I can only speak from my own experience, which is reading the whole chunk all together in one sitting. So I'll talk about some of the negatives because I think the biggest complaints I have with this plot objectively is a lot of the key components of the plot are very, very derivative of other young adult novels. And this is not a slam on Brittany Wang, because in looking at her kind of social media presence, she kind of capitalizes on these very,
if you
very
liked this, you'd probably like this,
right?
Kind of
and
thing.
So she even references things like the Hunger Games, and in promoting her own material. So that, I feel like, is a little problematic, because it almost feels too derivative of these very common, very popular plots. So, for example, the fairies, there's 5 fairies, fairy types of fairies. They immediately, like, at the beginning of the book, are all established, like, they all have their, like, ethos or whatever, which immediately feels like Divergent. It's like the 5 factions, and then the pirates are people that have been kicked out of their clan, so it's the factionless are now the pirates. And then, even, this is a big spoiler, so if you do not want spoilers, please read the book first, because
I will have much to say about some spoilery things too.
Yes,
so
this is your final warning if you don't want spoilers. But then, even in getting into so we have these Divergent fairies, these factionless pirates. They're going to have a Hunger Games battle for the Infinity Stones that have all the power for the crown. They all the main cast have Avengers superpowers. Then they find out, like, in the very end of the book, that there's a District 13 of the Mystics underground. Like, it all feels like the same song and dance of all these really, really popular stories. And then even in this, like, subplot of a love romance thing with Quinn and Aaron, and then, like, Hickory is, like, sweet on Vale, and Vale seems sweet on Aaron. It's like, even that feels like Twilight all over again. It all feels so tropey, and like the author, and I don't know if this was her intent. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine for you and your art to be inspired by other works, and to be like, oh, that's a cool plot, I'm gonna borrow it and then write my own story. That's fine, I really don't have a problem with it. But then the fact that she's kind of like, if you liked Finnick Odair from the Hunger Games, you'll like this character that I wrote, who's basically a copy paste of that character. And I just feel like that, I just don't like that. I just really don't like that. And I feel like those aspects of the plot really overshadow how well this world has been written and built, and the other plots that are not derivative of other YA content. So, for example, like I guess the main plot of the story, I guess you could say, is these different trials that our main cast of characters have to go through, and it's sort of like the Hunger Games. So each one focuses on the kind of standard quality of each fairy clan, and then so it kind of feels like a Divergent Hunger Games kind of combination.
Yeah.
And then, as we continue through the story, we find out that there's a prophecy, there's this plague affecting fairies called the Gnolls, there's this unknown, like, race of people ancient race called the Numa, there's this issue with pixie dust being mined, and it has a lot of power, and there's kind of like, it's essentially like this currency that's used amongst the fairies, and then there's this kind of power play over who has the, kind of the pixie dust, and then there's also this plot of, this change of power with the queen, and, who's going to take the next position ruling over all of the fairy clans. And then we also have these maybe like mutated, altered sort of fairies that kind of appear, and like, are people being experimented on? Like, all of these other plots I think are really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And overall, the plot then begins to feel really messy, because we have these pre-existing storylines that have been essentially, I'm not saying this as a negative, but that feel like they've been borrowed from other work. And then we have these really original, interesting, intricate plots that now one of them seems to distract from the other. And I feel like the trials is set up as, this is the main plot, is these different trials. And then as we go, we kind of get info dumped on these other original plot lines. And now the trials seem like a distraction from the main plot, which is, this plague and this person's, missing / kidnapped. And then, here are these creatures that we don't know where they came from. And so that, I feel like we have two visions for this story. And one is negatively a copy paste of other popular works. And then we have this really interesting world that's presented to us, these really intricate, interesting plots that I want to learn more about. And then it's like, well, I can't learn more about it because now we have to watch this trial that's like a beauty contest. And to me, that just felt really boring. And I was like, in reading this story, I felt like the trials overall, the first two trials were really boring. I was not very interested in those at all. They felt distracting from these other more interesting plot lines. The third trial, which is technically like the fourth novella, is where things finally felt like we were getting things interesting. So I think it's a problem when you're halfway through the story and you're not really engaged because there's so much going on and you don't know which thread to follow. And I wish that Brittany Wang had kind of dialed back and I believe her intention is to write a total of 4 series.
Books about as big as this one. Yeah.
Right. And so if that's the goal, is to have 4 pretty beefy novels.
About 2,000 pages total.
Yeah. I wish we had dialed back and saved some of these threads for later, or thrown out some of the more tropey plot lines and just focused on maybe a little bit more deeply focusing on some of those more interesting plots. So that's kind of my overall perception. A couple other kind of negatives, and these are kind of more general. There's a lot of tropes and stereotypes and concepts that are just overused, like what I just kind of mentioned. The things, Quinn as kind of our main protagonist, it's very much like a hero's journey storyline, which I don't mind. But then we also have, she's kind of this reluctant princess. She doesn't want to be a ruler. She wants to go her own way kind of thing, which again, I don't think is a negative, but it's very overplayed at this point. I do like her relationship with her father being really strained, and her brother's like the golden child, and she's, less appealing. All of that's very heavy, very overused just in young adult stories in general. But I do like that she has this kind of hero's journey, and she's probably like the least talented amongst the 5. And so I like that she's not immediately good at everything because she's our protagonist. So I did appreciate that aspect. A couple things I thought were a little, not sloppy, but I don't know how else to kind of word it, but a little clumsy, I guess would be the best way to put it, is this third trial. We finally have an interesting trial where it's, all of the contestants have been poisoned. Now I have to find a remedy for their poison. I think that's very, very interesting. It felt life-threatening, felt like our heroes were finally in some kind of real peril, and having to use skills that they may or may not have seemed very prepared for. And then in the very middle of it, while they all have a ticking time bomb of dying, we're going to stop and talk about this prophecy for what feels like a really long time. And I felt like, okay, this is like every movie when the characters are running away from some mortal threat, and now we're going to stop and have a 20-minute conversation. And it's like, we still need this information, but can we kind of fit it in somewhere that feels a little bit more organic and less like corny? Then the goblins appearing there, it felt really out of left field. Again, it's a really interesting plot, but it felt like it was poor timing. Kind of the main plot of with the Gaius, we find out, this is, again, a huge spoiler, we find out he's alive. I think that was great. I was kind of suspicious of it because I'm like, that would be a really good twist. Try get in the mind of the storyteller and be like, that would be a really good twist. But the way it's delivered just felt really messy in how it was delivered to us. It being delivered during a character's that we don't know if we can trust or not trust, his profession of love to our main character. And then we also find out that this is really important information given to the reader. It felt like I couldn't take the information seriously because I didn't think the delivery felt genuine. But again, it's kind of like, that's kind of feel like is the overall issue I had with the plot, is that sometimes we had these really good nuggets, but maybe the delivery was a little clumsy, or there was just too much being delivered at the same time. But all of that to say, it still felt surprisingly easy to follow. With all these threads, I feel like objectively it's too much to give to your reader, but the way that it was presented to us may have felt a little clumsy at times, but I was able to follow every point. Like, I knew by the end of the story, for sure, I understood all of these multiple threads. And
it's almost like we are digesting what we are fed at a good rate, but it may not be like the flavor we wanted at that moment.
Right.
And so something may feel awkward, but it doesn't mean that it's unable to be digested.
Right. And it's not inherently bad. I think a lot of these plots are good and interesting plots, but like you said, the flavor or the way we're receiving them just didn't feel like it was quite, it's like you take a bite of a tart and it's savory and you're expecting something sweet.
Right.
So that's kind of that's why the biggest reason I didn't give this full points. One, because of, I think, a lot of the derivative stories that we've already read before, I think were a little unnecessary, because I think there were so many good original stories that could have been presented in a different backdrop, against a different backdrop other than the Hunger Games, Divergent, things like that. Some positives though. I think the world building and the intricacy of the different fairy clans, who they are, the way that they're designed, the way that their ethos or whatever fits all of them very well. Their kind of like defining characteristic felt organic to each of these individuals. I got a very clear picture of visually what these people look like, what this world looks like, where these people live, just kind of their going about. It all felt like a real world that these people really live in. And so that was really, really good. Some other positives, I thought the Queen's deal with Quinn that she makes is fantastic. I really liked that. Instead of her trying to help Quinn win, she wants to have Quinn help her daughter win, and then she'll give Quinn her freedom and everything she wanted. I thought that was very interesting because it gives Quinn less of a motivation to perform well, which if she doesn't perform well, like, it doesn't matter, she's just trying to help another competitor win. I thought that was really great. I really liked that as an underlying plot. I liked the fact that we slowly find out these different competitors' various abilities. Alice in particular, I thought finding out her abilities, like the myth behind, why she doesn't touch people, and then finding out she has a healing ability, and then finding out how she's mute, but she can communicate by physical contact, like her thoughts can be, and then how she can, if she touches two people, they can all kind of like read each other's
collective
minds.
Mind, yeah.
Yeah, that was just great. I loved that. I felt like I was getting something really fresh and original there, and it was handled very tastefully. Vale as a character, I'll talk about it in characters, but I like that kind of towards the end, she wants to win fair and square. She doesn't want to have the things handed to her at the end. Was nice. The Dryad trial with them being poisoned, I thought was a great trial. It finally felt like one that fit the best in that world. I thought the arc of Quinn's dad was actually really interesting, how we learn more about him as a character and maybe why he resents Quinn the way he does, which again, I like that it's kept kind of vague. We don't know if that's the real reason, but I like that we kind of slowly unveil him as we go throughout the story. I think one of the best moments I found towards the end of the book is when we find out a little bit more about how Quinn's brother is actually still alive, and how the narrative comparison of Aaron to Wit as that kind of betrayal. I thought that was just brilliant storytelling. You immediately get an idea of what Quinn's feelings are in that matter. I felt like that was a great aspect of storytelling. Other parts of the story that I think, I can't say it's objectively bad because I'm not sure where I stand on it, but kind of towards the end of the story, we find out that this kind of plot that we really are given at the beginning of the story, of the moon rain being necessary, and then we find out that this like mystical species of the Numa are actually humans, and that there is this world that we're reading about kind of coexists with the human world. And so it's actually like this kind of meta narrative, if you will, of how humans in the human world impact the fairies in their world, and this kind of symbiotic relationship that's needed between the two. I don't know. It's given so succinctly in the story it's presented to us. I'm not sure. I can't give credit or fault for it in this category specifically, because I don't know if this is just too much for a fantasy story. I completely understand that this is the direction the author wants to go, and this is part of her story. It felt very intentional, but it almost felt like a little too much information right there at the end of the story, when, like I said, we've been digesting a huge beefy amount of various plot lines and conflicts, and now we have this, oh, and by the way, this is impacted by the human world, which would be us as the reader. And so I can't give or take away points for this, because I can't say for sure in finishing the story if this is a flaw in the story, but it did feel a little like it was just, we ate a huge, 7-course meal, and now we've been given, this other, oh, guess what? It's actually 8 courses. And it's like, we already had
I was actually going to make a similar, I guess, analogy. I was going to say, it's like going to a dinner party expecting to have courses brought to you one by one. Mm-hmm. And instead they put a buffet spread and say, make sure you clean your plate. And you're like, I don't even know where to start, or make heads or tails. And now all of the flavors are like blending on top of each other, and it's really hard to keep things distinct. Yeah. Not to say that any of it is confusing, but it's just too much at one time sometimes.
Right. And so that being given to us really at the end, it almost was like we could have saved this for the next book. Like, we could have saved this maybe towards the end of the last book. I don't know. I don't know what direction the author is wanting to go. But overall, I think that the reason I did give this kind of half credit is because in following the plot, I felt like it was pretty difficult to kind of trudge up the mountain for the first half of this book. But by the time you kind of get to the peak, which I would say about the halfway mark, and then you can kind of see where you've come from, and you can see that the bottom of the mountain that you now get to go down. By the time you get to the bottom, it's very, very satisfying. And I think it wraps everything together nicely at the end. The destination is worth the journey throughout the whole way. So I do think it has a lot of good components to the plot, but there were some things that were just kind of tough to navigate through and digest through. I took notes on my phone as I was going, and so I'm just making sure it didn't. So one other thing, I couldn't fit it on my paper because my handwriting, I write too much. The only other thing was the fact that, actually no, I'll save that for characters. So I would not say that this plot is bad. I just feel like there's just so much to digest throughout the way. And so for that and the fact that there's some derivative lines, threads in the plot, I would say it's really not bad, but it's also not as like clear and succinct as I think it could be. So that's why I gave it kind of half credit. So 1.5 out of 3.
Okay. So for me, for plot, story, delivery, and world building, I also gave this 1.5 points out of 3.
I'm surprised.
So let me just preface by saying that, like, I read this book and enjoyed it so much. I was like, Holland, I really want you to read this as well. And I would really like to talk about it on podcast. So my enjoyment of this book is pretty high. However, I part of this show is that we take something and we analyze it as objectively as we can. And so what that means is sometimes I have to put personal bias aside to talk about things that I do think are flaws. And I agree with a lot of what you said. There are some derivative things, and I don't think that's necessarily bad, but when it starts to feel like every other plot point is something I've seen before or read before or has already been adapted into a movie series, it starts to be like, oh, okay. And it starts to feel kind of like you said, where it's like, we're going along, we're digesting everything, but now it just feels like another element that we didn't necessarily need right now. Part of me wonders, and this is just speculation, if perhaps Brittany Wang wasn't sure how successful the series would be, and so she wrote something that could be wrapped up here and be done. And, if it didn't reach the audience desired, or maybe didn't do as well as she hoped, then she may not feel like she must continue. But perhaps because she has been getting, a fan base and positive feedback, now she feels like she can continue to expand. I don't know. I'm just speculating at this point. But I do think that there are a lot of good things, and I do think there are some things that fall flat. And again, I wouldn't call any of those things that fall flat bad things, because they've been proven to be successful in other stories. So everything that felt genuinely 100% crafted out of her mind for this world and these characters, those things that felt 100% new, are the best things about the entire plot. I think that the world building, the world itself, is so compelling, and it feels like a place where, like, you kind of want to visit just to see. I think the way that everything is sort of described, each of the different clans and areas that they kind of preside. There is a map in the book. I love maps in fantasy books. There's also a pronunciation guide. Maybe that could fall more into quality of writing, which we'll talk about, but I love when fantasy books give you a pronunciation guide so that you don't...
Yeah, there's a glossary in the back.
So that you don't mispronounce your characters' names for 12 years and then look silly in front of your friends when you talk about it later. So I appreciate that, because I feel like if you're going to have names that are a little bit more unusual, it's helpful for a reader to know how you picture that as an author being pronounced. So I really appreciate, I think she's very fantastical about the way that she builds the world's rules. And I'll talk about everything that falls under that umbrella in my head. And when I say fantastical, I mean in a way that feels like a fantasy book, but never feels unrealistic to that world. It would be unrealistic in our actual reality, sure, but I think the tidbits that feel so strange to us in our regular human lives feel so naturally, placed in this world of Phelan. And I think that that's the best thing that you can get from fantasy, is when every element of how the world works feels correct. Like you're not scratching your head like, what do you mean there are 5 different kinds of fairies and they all act differently? Like, that shouldn't... I never came to a point where I was like, that's just too much, or that doesn't make any sense. The world's rules on magic feel very well thought out. Even things like the differences in customs between the Fae, and how, there are certain, character qualities, character traits that are valued higher with different clans. And I think that is all, it all kind of makes sense. And yeah, it is a little bit derived of something like Divergent, but I think that if you were to just take it for what it is in the world building, it's it's built nicely into the explanation of the people, and even the history of Phelan, and that's kind of, dived into a little bit when you get to the point where they discover the prophecy, and Hickory's visions about the Pneuma and things like that. Those are all interesting history bits that are woven in, and I just think that those things are really, really nice, and I really enjoy those things. One thing that I was a little bit, I don't know, kind of split between both surprised and disappointed is how the beginning of the book really sets it up to make it feel like this is going to be a pirate story.
Yeah.
And by the time you're at the end of the first section or first novella, this is not a pirate story.
Yeah.
It's simply used as a, I guess, contextual understanding that Quinn has chosen a life that is, for all intents and purposes, disapproved of by all of these by all of these fairy clans, especially the royalty, which she is on equal standing with. So it's almost like the pirate plot line is really more of a character context than it is an actual plot. Now, okay, I understand that, you know, characters like the pirate Lord Maverick or whatever his name is, he does become relevant again. Okay, I get it. But I don't think that the pirate plot has enough significance through the main thread of the story that it almost feels like a tease.
It does.
And
I agree.
I personally love pirate things, and I was like really excited to read this fantasy about fairies and pirates because I was like, oh my gosh, it's like two of my favorite things. And then it felt like the pirate thing was just taken away so quickly, and I was like, oh, this isn't a pirate story? I thought this was a pirate story. And Quinn does not act that much like a pirate when removed from piracy. So it's I have
a lot to say about that in character. Well, not a lot, but I'm going to touch on that in characters too, because I felt the same thing.
So I felt like if you're going to make that such an important part of the setup, it should have some sort of bearing or relevance on at least moments in the plot. And I felt like, aside from the fact that Pirate Lord Maverick becomes relevant again toward the end, it's not really relevant, and that was a disappointment for me a bit. There are so many tropes in this story.
Yeah.
I do not think tropes are bad inherently. Let me make that clear. There are some tropes that I like a whole lot.
Well, and with like art media and storytelling, I feel like there are tropes that resonate with everyone.
Right.
And so a lot of times we intentionally seek out
those
stories
tropes, yeah,
with those tropes because we find like relevancy in our own lives.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of a reflection on ourselves. Yeah. It's kind of like when you're sad and you listen to sad music. It's just like an extension of whatever, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, I agree. But there are so many. Let me list you just a few. Dead parent. Yep. Overly stern parent. Someone is not really dead that is important to the main character or characters. Rivals to lovers. Rivals to allies. Found family. The grass is greener on the other side. Those are just a handful of the tropes that are found. And again, while I do not think tropes are bad at all, it feels like too many.
Yeah.
And so it feels a little bit like I'm gonna try to hit every emotionally vulnerable beat that I can, to try to hit the vulnerability of a reader. And while I can respect that, I think it would have been more interesting perhaps to maybe cut the tropes in half and expand each one.
Yeah.
I'm not a writer, so I'm not trying to be too critical. I'm not trying to tell you which tropes she should have picked or whatever. I just think that once you sit down and you realize how many tropes are actually present in the book, it starts to feel a little bit like, okay, well, what walls can we break instead of tropes? You know what I mean? I want to see things a little bit more. I want to see expectations subverted a little more instead of let me paint another trope for you.
And the moments where I feel like were most satisfying were when our expectations were subverted.
Exactly. So things like Gaius's death, that is a trope that I actually loved, was Gaius not actually being dead. That is technically a trope. Somebody's not really dead.
Yeah.
But in this case, I thought that it was really, really nice because you can miss a lot of those clues unless you're looking for them in the way through. And while I agree that maybe the delivery of the fact that he is still alive was clumsy, yeah, I think it could have been placed differently or maybe delivered by a different character. So I agree with that. But I think the fact that it's true is really, really it's a nice change. And I also think it's a nice character moment for Quinn because now her motivations shift again.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of tropes.
I felt like that being used as leverage is also a trope. Is like when the queen tries to leverage that against Quinn. That's a huge trope, but it fit. It worked well in that story. That part of the story.
I think the biggest tropes that I have issues with is the dead parent and stern parent. Because it does feel like what we've seen a lot in all kinds of media, not just fantasy, but
we did it twice. We did it with Quinn and Vale.
Right, exactly. And then also the like rivals to blank. Sometimes I kind of just want to have our rivals keep being our rivals. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I'm not gonna say that I'll talk about that in characters too. I'm not gonna say I dislike some of the relationships between the five, but it's like when you start reading, you're like, okay, they're all gonna be friends by the end of it. Like you can kind of just call it early. I do think that things do peak right at the Dryad trial, and I think a lot of that, and I'll talk again about this in characters, a lot of that has to do with the involvement of Alice in the plot and her family, and everything there starts to feel really interesting. And then that level of interest stays. It doesn't really dip for me at all from that point forward. But it is a little bit harder. That first half of the book does feel a little bit slower. And okay, maybe we're doing a lot of like plot building and establishing things. And okay, I understand you're going to have some of that. But after the pirate stuff ended, which was my initial interest hook was the pirate stuff, and now that's gone. So now I'm like, oh, okay. So now we're going through all the sylph stuff and all the nymph stuff, and I'm like, okay.
That's how I felt too.
By the time we get to Alice's area, now we're in the Dryad trial, I was like, okay, now I'm invested. And that was when I knew I was going to finish this book. There was no questions about it. Like they had me at that point.
I think the other thing was, I think with the first two trials, the stakes just didn't feel like it was high enough for the trials, the 1 and 2. I didn't feel like there was any risk for any of our characters.
Yeah, I think that while I appreciate the fact that it's not quite as like heavy-handed as the Hunger Games, where it's like if you lose you die, like I'm thankful it wasn't like that. But especially in the first two trials, especially in the first two trials. But I do think that like there should have been a better ramp up, and it just kind of felt like we were like chilling, dying, and it's just a little bit imbalanced. I think just the change between those first two into the last three.
I also thought, like, as I was reading, I couldn't figure out why did all of the clan leaders, like the royalty, why did they all agree to make every trial life-threatening? Like, if your heir is participating, why would you not all agree that, like, hey, let's not kill anybody?
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
I don't know.
Like,
maybe it simply is tradition. I'm not sure. Since the Ethodine's been around for a while, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway.
No, because they brought the Ethodine back.
That's true. But it's not like it was the first Ethodine ever.
Right.
So
it just didn't make any sense. Because it's like, all right, we have 5 trials. And if somebody dies in each one, then guess
you win by
left.
default.
Right.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out. It's like, okay, so they're going to kill somebody in every trial? Well, that doesn't seem like it's going to work because they're trying to build all these characters together.
Yeah.
So I guess nobody's going to die. So then there's no real threat to any of them.
Yeah, I can understand that too. I think that's one of the more vague things I think in the book is like, are they actually in danger or not, kind of thing.
Which by the time you're in the 3rd trial and the 4th
It does feel dangerous. Yeah.
It does.
But it's almost like a false sense of security until we get there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, all of that to say 1.5 points out of 3 for me as well.
Cool. All right, so our next category for books is not characters. It's quality of writing, and a total possible score of 1. I give this 0.5 point. Overall, some of the issues with the plot being a little bit messy and the delivery of that, I kind of took into account here, so I'm not going to rehash everything I already said. I think the pacing and the complexity of these multiple plot lines being delivered to us all at the same time, I think is just a little clumsy. And I feel like clumsy is the right word because it's not that the author has any major flaws as an author, it's just so much to try and deliver to your reader. Overall, the writing style feels very plot and character heavy and not as descriptive. I think the descriptions of the characters are very clear. I got a very clear picture of the way these individuals look and like the different members of the different fairy clans look, even these minor characters. Mm-hmm. Even descriptions, like specifically like the descriptions of the dryad characters having, animal-esque traits to them, and even the way that there are the possibility of having like halfling fairies with parents from 2 different clans, and how those individuals would look different compared to ones that have 2 parents from the same clan. Things like that. You got a very clear picture of what these people look like, and kind of actions and movements throughout the plot, but not a whole lot of descriptions of very, very detailed descriptions of the world. And there weren't a lot of emotive descriptions. So like, I know how Quinn is, what she's thinking, but I don't particularly have a good conceptualization of how she's feeling, except for all these moments where I feel like there's a flaw in the plot too, where it's like, you can use your magic if you just let it go. I felt like I was watching Frozen all over again. But I do think just it's overall pretty standard for a young adult novel. It's not too in the weeds. It's not overly flowery. It gives you the information to follow along with the story, and not really any more, any less. It's kind of the general reason I gave this half credit. I did find a few like typos and grammatical errors in the story. Picky grammatical errors, but they were still there. And then there were some moments where in reading a sentence, maybe if a comma had been in there, I had to like reread it a couple times to figure out like exactly who was thinking this or who was being described here. I also thought that this kind of late exposition towards the latter half of the very last novella of the story, a ton of exposition with the mystics, and it just felt very like everything kind of grinded to a halt, and now we get just
like momentum.
Yeah, page after page of just exposition about the mystics and who they are, and the pneuma, and all the, all this stuff, and the staff, and the, bringing the infinity stones together, and the blood oath thing. Like, all of that was just like, oh my gosh, I felt like we were at a nice little clip. We were moving right along. We were going to get to the end of this story. It was like culminating in this nice epic ending. And then all of a sudden we just like slam on the brakes. We hit a brick wall. And now let me tell you about the history of my people. Like, that's what it kind of felt like. And I just felt like it was way too late in the game to get all of that. Like, we had a really nice rhythm going, and I do think the very final battle, both in the last trial and the kind of final battle at the end, were written very, very well. And the one kind of like positive I noticed was I feel like writing combat can be extremely difficult to visualize and follow. And Brittany Wang does a great job at describing combat and keeping it interesting and keeping it fresh. And you have a very clear visual in reading the narrative. You have a very clear visual of what's happening, who's moving where things are kind of falling into play. It's written very cinematically. And so it's a big positive for that, the last trial and then the final battle at the end. But then in the middle of that, we have this very lengthy exposition. And I felt like that could have been put somewhere else along the way to avoid that kind of drastic halt in our momentum of the story. I had to write it down because it just really, really annoyed me was this is so tiny, but when they're in the nymph world and they have waterbenders there, like they're waterbenders moving water magically and they're called water manipulators. I was like, this is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Water manipulators. Why don't we just come on, we can come up with anything else. We're calling these people water manipulators. It sounded so bad when I was reading.
How dare they be emotionally abusive to that water?
I know, it's like manipulate, like, and it's like so many syllables, but like just call them waterbenders.
Yeah,
just call them waterbenders, or call them like just like, I don't know, anything else. But I was just like, water. I just almost I laughed out loud when I was reading. I was like, we couldn't think of anything else. Water movers would be better than that. It felt so awful. I was like, this is the worst. And then every time I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't. But I will say another, so that's kind of in general. I don't have a ton to say because I think a lot of the way that the plot's presented kind of falls into the quality of writing as well. But I will say, I love a good epilogue. The epilogue in this book is fantastic.
It is.
I love how it changes. The first person narrator now becomes the queen, who's been the villain for our story. And it's like going back to our food analogy, it's like a really satisfying dessert right at the end there. And then sets us up for what the next story should or could contain. It gives us a new villain. It still ties us all back to the very beginning of the story.
I like a nice full circle
yes moment. I love a good epilogue, and I feel like it's really easy to write an epilogue very clumsily and just to have it be more.
I also think sometimes epilogues can feel fan servicey.
Yeah.
Like, everybody just wants to know what happens to them 5 years down the road or whatever. And I think this doesn't do that. It doesn't feel like that. It just feels like a natural extension to what we have seen resolve.
Yeah. So I think it's just done really, really well. It sets us up for a nice sequel, but then it also, I think a lot of epilogues just give us more questions than answers and feel like now you're like in a bad way teasing your audience. And I hate epilogues that when you read the epilogue, you're like, well, now I'm mad because you just gave me all these questions and I had a nice satisfying ending of the story, and now you've unraveled this satisfying ending. And I feel like this is exactly how an epilogue should be written, in that it doesn't unravel the end of our heroes. It's not just undermined everything they've done. It instead gives us a new conflict that we're going to be able to get more insight into. Because, I mean, you probably can think of, an example. I can't off the top of my head. But I hate when you read an epilogue and it basically says, everything our heroes accomplished. Just kidding. They didn't actually accomplish anything.
Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know they're out there and I know I've read them.
Yeah. So I think this is fantastic. I think the ending, it again makes the ending so satisfying because it more so gives the reader a bit of a sneak peek into more happenings that our protagonist might not be aware of, but now we have a little behind the scenes look there. So I thought that was done really well. It just further made the ending even more satisfying. But overall, I didn't think there were a huge amount of positives or a huge amount of negatives, so that was kind of the reason I gave it half credit, so 0.5 out of 1.
Okay. So for me, for quality of writing, I did give this full points. I did notice a couple grammatical errors and typos, but it wasn't weighty enough comparatively for me to take anything off. So I generally really like the pacing, but I think what shines the most is the use of vocabulary and just the general style of this novel. I really like when a fantasy novel uses vocabulary that is interesting and different enough from my own, but isn't so complicated that I feel like I have to pull out a dictionary every time I sit down to read it. And I thought there was a very nice balance between words that were new to me, but explained well because maybe they were created words for the world or the kind of style of speaking, depending on whatever character, but nothing so overly complex that I felt like I was reading Shakespeare and I didn't understand what was going on. I think there's a really nice balance there, and it wasn't ever confusing. One thing that I did notice, this is more of an observation than a critique or praise, is that there really is kind of a lack of humor in this story. And I was kind of reflecting, like, do I like that or do I not like that? I mean, I like to laugh. Everybody likes to be silly every once in a while. I mean, we're silly on this show sometimes. But I realized that I really don't think that this is that kind of story. So I think it's okay and appropriate that there's really not much humor. There are some moments of levity. I'm not going to say that, like, the whole thing feels like a drag or anything like that. But it does have a little bit more of, like, a mission-minded style than, like, a LOL, we're going to, you know, shoot the puns out and stuff like that. Like, it really just doesn't feel like that kind of story. So I accept it, but I really didn't use it to, like, gauge if I wanted to add that as, like, a praise or a negative.
I feel like the closest thing to humor that we get, like a moment, is at the end when they're playing that game in the pub.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of the closest thing we have. And it's not necessarily humorous, but it feels like our one moment of levity amongst our characters.
Yeah, like we get to see our characters take a breather after, you know, like metaphorically holding their breath for so much of the story, and having their old... It's like a moment where they kind of get to lay their burdens down for 20 minutes. And I think that's a side of the characters that we needed to see at that moment. So I think it's a good moment. I kind of like that they are, in a way, 6 novellas that were put together. I think if you felt like the book was intimidatingly long, it's a nice natural way to kind of break it up. If you wanted to put it down for a year between 2 and 3 and pick it up, I think you would, it reminds you enough. It has enough of, like, recap kind of as you go when you start a new novella without feeling like you're watching, like, you know how some shows will be like, previously on blah, 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 and it's like 7 minutes of recap. It never feels that much, but it feels like if you were to put it down and then pick it back up later between novellas or sections, I guess you could say in this case, that it would still feel natural enough that you could just pick it up and continue and not feel like I don't remember anything that's going on. So I think that that's a nice thing, and probably has to do with the fact that they were first published as 6 novellas and not as 1. So it would make sense if people were reading them in that style that they would, you know, oh, I wasn't able to pick this one up yet, but now I got it. And it's been 4 to 6 months or however long since I've read this one. And I think that that's a nice thing to do. It's cool because I think that when you read it as a whole collection, it also just doesn't feel like a stop and start either. I don't know how that balance was achieved, but in my opinion, it was. And I think that that's something to be commended. The only other thing that I really want to talk about here in quality of writing is I personally get very frustrated when I pick up a young adult book and I start to read it, and there is now content that I would consider not appropriate for young adults. This is an adult novel that may have shallow characters.
Or teenage
characters. Yeah, or you know, college-aged characters. And I get very frustrated when this is marketed for, you know, 14 up, but I would not allow a minor to read something because of the content inside. I think if you're going to have content like that, it needs to be marketed as an adult book so that adults are reading it and it doesn't accidentally get in the hands of somebody that should not be consuming content like that. And the reason that I say that is because I'm thankful to Brittany Wang, because she tells you straight out of the bat that this is a no spice romance, and I would be able to give this to a 14-year-old and not be concerned with what may be inside. I don't have to do any preemptive screening to know that this book is safe for all audiences.
Right.
And I really appreciate that. I am an adult, and I personally don't like reading content like that, and it makes me wildly uncomfortable, and I don't really care to partake, so I skip things like that in books that they become present in as I'm reading that. I fast forward through it on movies and TV shows. So I think that it's even more concerning when something is labeled as young adult and then has adult content in it. I think that it's false advertising.
I think the line has been blurred significantly in young adult literature because I think there are so many adults that prefer to read young adult novels, and so now they go to that section of the library or their bookstore and they want to pick up a young adult novel, but they want it to be less childish, which means it has more explicit content. And so I think that's a very valid point, because I remember as a kid going to the library and I would go to the young adult section and pick up books off the shelf, and my parents never had to screen anything in there because they were like, it's in that safe section of the library.
I would say over the last decade, it has exponentially become more of a common thing. And I really don't mean to sound like a prude, but I think that you need to be careful about what you are marketing toward minors that's not appropriate for them,
right? Or that their parents should be allowed to make that decision,
correct,
and give that discretion,
right?
If a parent wants to let their kid read, 50 Shades of Grey,
right?
They should, but they shouldn't pick up a book like this, and then their kids like reading 50 Shades of Grey without the parents' knowledge.
Correct. Especially when, and that's a lot of the thing is that a lot of young adult novels are just marketed as, oh, this is a fun, cutesy fantasy novel. And then all of a sudden there's a half a chapter that should be omitted from this child's eyes. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, and I agree. It's like, this is either something that adults need to be choosing because they're adults and can make that decision, or parents of a minor should be making that decision because, if anything, we should protect the youth. That's all I'm saying.
Well, it's tough because with books, we don't have, like, the MPAA has ratings that we can kind of have an idea of, is this appropriate for my kid or not? Books don't have that.
Exactly. So. I mean, there are parents' guides available on the internet that are supremely helpful, but books are hard to screen because they, especially 500 pages, what parent has time to sit down and read this quickly enough for their kid to still have interest in it?
Right.
I know that was a long tangent, but I wanted to make note of it
it's because a very good point.
I think that it is something that I highly respect, because I think that in no way does this book feel childish to me.
Right.
There are, complex characters and deep, like messages and morals present in the story. And I know we didn't talk about them a lot, but it's something I just want to make note because I think it's a problem in books today. And I think that people should be aware of what they're reading before they're reading it. And if you choose to read those novels that have, adult content in them, that is your prerogative. And I'm not here to necessarily like tell you no, but if you're 15, I think that is a difference than if you're 25. Like, there is a huge difference in that. And I think that I appreciate when a novel is presented and delivers to you for what it is, and there are no surprises in regards to adult content. That's my point. I will move on. 1 out of 1 point for quality of writing.
I think that's a great point. And we try to include disclaimers on our podcast because we are a family-friendly podcast, but we don't always cover family-friendly content. So I think it's a good, I like that we typically include if something may or may not need viewer discretion. So.
Right. And that's all it is we just want you to be aware of what you're getting into before you're into it, because I think so many people jump into a media not knowing what they're getting, and now they're surprised, embarrassed, made uncomfortable, whatever. And
I think also as a kid, there's nothing worse when you're of that age, like a young, like preteen and teenager, and you read a book and you get to the point where you've come across a scene that you know is not appropriate for you.
Yeah.
And now you have to put the book away and you don't get to find out what happens later.
I know.
And like I've had that happen to me as a kid when I've been reading books, and like I'm like, I
know I should not be reading this.
Yeah. Not everybody has that kind of perspective.
So.
But I would, if you're starting something, you want to know, at least I think for a parent, you want to know that something's safe for your kid to digest.
Correct.
So, that's a great point, I think, and that's a good place to kind of bring it up in there too. This book is E for everyone.
Yes, so. E for everyone.
Okay, next category.
It might be a little complicated if you're like 5, but
well, video games are rated E, but that doesn't mean a 5-year-old can play them.
True.
So maybe 10 and up.
Yeah, 10 and up just for
E10.
Yeah, for vocab purposes. That's all.
Yeah. All right. So next category is characters. So total possible score of 3. I gave this 2 out of 3. So I think along with the plot, this book gets progressively better as you go. So for the first kind of half of the book, I would probably, like, if I only made it to half of the book and stopped, I would probably give this like half a point, because I think the characters to start have a lot to be desired, but they become more richly developed as the story goes. And if I had like one statement to make about this book, I would say if you're reading it and you find it difficult to continue and you haven't gotten to the halfway point yet, keep going. Yeah. Because that's how I felt in
even
reading
if it's a slog, get to the middle point and you will hopefully, like we did, feel different about that.
Yeah. And so I feel like I felt that way with these characters as well. I do like stories that are written in first person narrator. I didn't mention that in the last category, but I think it really gives you a good perspective of your characters. So I'll kind of touch on a couple different things. At the beginning of the story, I think that Quinn and Gaius's relationship feels very organic. And I think this may be getting a little into the weeds, but I like reading an author's like thanks and acknowledgements. And so Brittany Wang at the back of her book has a lot to say. And she mentions that she has 2 brothers and that they're the Gaius to her Quinn. And I think it's very telling that this author who is writing a female protagonist character, and the author who is a female, she must have a great relationship with her brothers, even if you didn't know that about her, because the relationship between Quinn and Gaius feels extremely organic. It feels they're both very kind to one another. They're compassionate with one another. They feel like they have a real bond. And when I was reading the story, I mean, it says at the back of the book, like which I read and forgot about. So when Gaius died, I was like, I quit. I'm done. I'm
12 pages in, but I don't want to do this anymore.
He was my favorite character, and now he's gone. And so then I read the back of the book, and I was like, when her brother dies, I was like, oh, well, I should have just known that ahead of time. So I think it's a great character development if a kind of crux of the plot is that the sibling, parent, whoever dies and you're mad about it. You did a good job of building that relationship. And so I think, again, although it's tropey, I think it works very well that Gaius seemed to be one of the only people that really understood Quinn for who she was and enjoyed her and appreciated her just the way she was. I think that's very necessary in stories where your main character is kind of this misfit character, that there's somebody in their life that actually like relates to them and understands them and appreciates them the way they are. Either establish it at the beginning or they find someone along the way. I think that's kind of needed. Otherwise, you as a reader are just get you lose hope for your protagonist. So I really, really liked that. I really enjoyed that part. Quinn as our protagonist, I think overall she's not a bad protagonist. She feels a little bit too much like a blank slate. for the majority of the story, except for the fact that she doesn't want to be the princess and she just wants to be a pirate and be the captain of her own ship. We don't really know or learn anything about her until like halfway through the book. And I think there's some... I don't know why we don't learn anything really about her until we get halfway through the book, and we don't see her really doing or trying anything that makes her appealing to us as a protagonist. I thought, like you said, we were going to really capitalize on this whole pirate thing. And she's been away from home for what, like 7 years or something like that?
5 or something.
Some crazy amount of time. And I fully expected that, okay, great. We've got this eclectic group of characters, and they're all from different fairy clans, so they all have their different strengths and weaknesses. And we've already established that Quinn is like the least qualified of her clan, which is their whole like character values are like strength and battle readiness and fighting and physical, warrior strength. And she's clearly sucks at that. So we find out in the first novella that she's a pirate and she wants to be a pirate captain. She's got this pretty good like natural leader ability with her crew, and she like looks out for them, and like she takes on the misfits, and like that's kind of her thing. Oh, and she like hides her face, and she's really theatrical and is good at like disguising herself and being really sneaky and crafty. Okay, maybe that we have this hero's journey who she doesn't fit the mold of her clan. So we find out she's got these other abilities. Okay, well then that's going to be her thing. It's like she's going to be a pirate in this Ethidine, and we're going to watch her do all these cool piratey things, kind of like a rogue thief kind of character. Nope, we don't get any of that. Her whole thing is she's a warrior and she's super strong, and she's going to train Vale on how to be a warrior. And at the last trial, where the whole focus is battling and fighting, she's going to be the champ at that. And it's like, well, hold on. We just set up this character to be somebody completely different. And then the whole story, she's not doing anything piratey. Nothing whatsoever. And it's like, I thought that I was, sold one thing and given another. And so I feel like there was a lot that we could have done with Quinn that we just didn't do with Quinn. And it just made it really kind of sad.
Yeah.
And like the whole thing with her is, instead of making her this kind of like roguish, piratey, like outcast character, we just made her this stoic, unfeeling, don't want to get close to anybody. I'm mad my brother died. I don't cry. I don't feel anything. I don't want to use my magic. And just this brooding, kind of moody character.
Yeah.
Who's like the exact opposite of who we were introduced to at the beginning, where she's this like kind of almost a happy-go-lucky kind of roguish pirate, which I thought was a great protagonist to follow, and we could like root for her the whole way. And then as soon as Gaius dies and she goes back, she just becomes this like closed off, walled off, like kind of boring character. And I think on the one hand that could give us an opportunity for growth, and I think we do see some growth in her. I think the real growth we see in her is the way that her relationship with Alice kind of develops and her relationship with Vale changes. And I like that. I thought that was really good, but I thought it was still pretty inconsistent with who we were introduced to at the beginning of the story. So it's not necessarily, I'm not bashing her as a character. I just think we had a really good start, and then we went in a completely different direction.
You know what it feels like? You ever seen like a sitcom, and you can tell between episodes 1 and 2 that like a year of time went by because they had to film the pilot and send it off for approval before they finally got a green light to make more. And it's been 9 to 12 months, and you can tell between episodes 1 and 2. That's kind of how it feels. Is like, it almost feels like that first establishing novella feels a little bit farther removed than the other 5 do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Just like in establishing Quinn as a character.
Yeah. And then you could almost give that little bit of leniency to her, except that at the end of the book, we find out it's only been 5 weeks.
Yeah.
It's been 5 weeks. And all of this has happened, which that's fine. 1 week for every trial. Like, that didn't bother me. But it's like, Quinn is so drastically different after the first week of the story. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense for me. And I wanted to like Quinn more than I ended up liking her in the story. I liked her way more at the beginning of the story than I did throughout, the first 4 trials. And I think that's, again, I feel like they kind of wiped her clean and made her a blank slate after Gaius dies. And then now she's so blank that I don't have anything to connect to with her. There's not a lot that I can really find a piece of myself in her. Not that every protagonist has to be a self-insert, but I think there needs to be something to relate to in your main character, especially from that first person perspective, so you have buy-in for the rest of the story and you want them to succeed. So I feel like it's this weird tension between like what we could have had with Quinn and what we were given with Quinn, and how she kind of grows and changes to how she ends up at the end of the story. It just feels a little unsatisfying to me for her as our main protagonist. Now, I do think that 2 of the best developed characters are Vale and Alice. I think the 2 of them, the way that we find out more about them as they go, the way that, Alice, I wouldn't say she has a ton of growth or change, but we learn more about her as we go. And so to us as the reader, we see new things and are learning new things about her. Vale, I think, has excellent growth. She does, the back of the book says that she's a pompous princess, and we do kind of see her as that at the beginning, and at the end we see somebody who really would have every quality you would want in a real queen and a leader. And I think that arc that she has is really, really nice. I think Vale and Quinn together have this nice foil with each other where they both have the kind of the dead parent trope, and so but then they also have this this different ends of the spectrum of their remaining parent is kind of never pleased with them. And so this constant need of approval with that parent, and the way that they approach that differently, and how Quinn's kind of journey in that part of her life versus Vale's journey of that part of her life, we kind of watch them parallel that together, I think is actually really nice. And it kind of gives them this commonality between each other, which I wish we had a little bit more exploration of that commonality, where they explore that commonality. But I think it's nice as a reader. I don't think you need to have that. I think it's just this nice kind of parallel between the 2. And I really liked that a lot. I think Vale as well has this real arc from being entitled to earning her own way in the world. And I think this is a nice growth for a character who's a little bit of this antagonist to Quinn, but she's not all the way to an enemy. I think that Hickory, he's an okay character, but I think he's pretty flat, and he seems to be really more of a plot device than a character, so I think he's kind of lacking in depth there. He really just seems like a character that's there to kind of remind them about these prophecies and the mystics and the pneuma and these visions, and so he really doesn't seem like an actual person. He just seems like he's there to help push Quinn into learning more about this kind of prophecy. The only like defining characteristics he has is he's partially blind, and he's an artist, and he's worried about going completely blind, and he doesn't like living in the dark. And other than that, we don't really know anything about him. And I just think he's kind of a weak character. I think, maybe we'll learn more about him as we go, like in the rest of the series. But I think for this story, he's pretty flat, but I don't think he's necessarily needed to be any more well-rounded. So it's not a flaw of the book, I don't think, but it does. I wish that we got a little more insight into who he is as a person. Oh yeah, and he has a crush on Vale. Like, whoop-de-doo. Like, it just seems like these very, like he has a lot of pegs to just like hang pieces of who he is on the wall, and then there's not really any more exploration of it. I really like the Queen as the villain. I think she's a fantastic villain. I really, really like how she has this very understandable motive to keep the ruling power in her own family and in her own clan. I think that's completely understandable. Like, who wouldn't want that? The deal that she makes with Quinn is very interesting. Like, she's willing to give Quinn what she wants, which is freedom and a pirate ship, and give her that. And I like that she's crafty enough. I thought it was just this delicate balance that was done so well. She's crafty enough that we think she's a little devious, but we're okay with it because she's going to give our protagonist what our protagonist wants. And yeah, there's some rumors about her, murdering her husband's this kind of Black Widow plot, which I kind of like. I thought it was clever. But we don't necessarily 100% think that she's the main villain because she's just being a little shady. But that's okay because Quinn's a pirate and she's giving Quinn what she wants. So there's this like morally gray aspect to her personality anyways. And then as we find out that she's actually kind of our main villain of the story, it all makes perfect sense. It feels very satisfying. And then we kind of watch her kind of ratchet up the evil that she's willing to go, the lengths that she's willing to go to maintain power. And I think you could argue that it's kind of an overdone trope that power being the main motive, but that it's a common motive. I mean, I don't think that's a flaw. I think it makes a great villain. So I really liked her.
I've heard it say once that in media, most, if not all, motivations can be umbrellaed under either love, money, or power.
Yep. So it's true. It's true. And so I really liked her as the villain. I thought she was very, very well crafted. And the way that we kind of progressively like suspect her more and more of being less than moral, I think is really, really nice. I also like that Quinn's dad is this antagonist who kind of has the opposite effect of the Queen, whereas the Queen we don't like initially, and then we're kind of like, well, maybe she's all right. Well, she's still kind of shady, but, oh my gosh, she's getting worse and worse and worse. We kind of have the opposite effect on Quinn's dad, where we're like, oh, this dude's bad. Like, he's bad news. And then as we slowly learn more and more about him, we're like, he's a little... I mean, he's still not great. Like, we're not excusing his behavior, but we're like, okay, I kind of understand him better. And he kind of comes around at the end, which I think is nice.
I don't have a note on this, so I'm going to piggyback off you real quick. So, you know how you said about how Quinn and Vale parallel each other? Mm-hmm. I also feel like their parents do in opposite directions.
I agree.
So, I really like that. I think it's nice.
Yeah, and it keeps things really fresh because... on the one hand, I think that, oh, what a coincidence. All these royal people just happen to be needed for this prophecy. Wow, how convenient that is. It's like, I think in the opposite way, it's like you're telling me that of all these people in the world, there's only one person that has a dead parent and the living parent doesn't like them. Yeah. No, that's a really common thing to be present in people's lives. And so I like that, like you just said, they kind of parallel each other. He is a bit of a stereotype, but by the end of the book, I really liked him as a character. And I liked his development and his growth. My biggest complaint,
I know where
characters in this story is Aaron. I cannot stand him. I can't stand him, like, the way that he, like, is as a character. And I also can't stand him even existing in this book. I think he is so useless. I think he is just a tropey love interest.
All the fangirls who love Aaron are going to come after you.
I don't care. Go ahead and come after me. Like, why do we have to have... I mean, the way that he's introduced is like every descriptive word about him is like we're setting him up to be the love interest. and this like heartthrob character, and it's like, oh, but he's just misunderstood, and like, oh my gosh, stop. Like every love interest trope is used on this guy, and he literally feels like a cardboard cutout. We don't know anything about him except that he has this magical gift, and he's engaged to this person he doesn't love, and
his parents also have a high expectation of him.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Great. Like, who cares? And then he's just pointlessly infatuated with Quinn for no reason. He never gives her a reason why he loves her until the very end of the story, where he's like, basically says, I love you because I can't make you love me. Like, that's not a reason. Like, that's a pretty bad reason.
I think I'll talk about it actually later when I start talking about characters.
I cannot stand him. We're given no explanation why he loves Quinn. I think he's absolutely the worst written character. He's extremely flat. I think this little love triangle between Vale and Aaron, and then Aaron and Quinn, and then Hickory and Vale, I think that whole...
Analysis over just here with her dragon chilling.
Yeah, she's like, I'm glad I can't talk to you people because you're all stupid. It's like, why? What is the purpose of this? It was so unnecessary, I guess, was why I find it so frustrating. And the only part I liked with Aaron that I thought was finally interesting is when we find out that the queen made him use his like manipulating siren voice to convince Quinn's dad that this dead body was actually his son. And I felt like we finally have this like interesting moment.
Yeah.
And I feel like we should have kept Aaron as this like potential villain in the story. We should have kept that throughout the whole thing, and then save it for 2 or 3 books down the road, and then build this romance plot into it, because there was so much going on that we couldn't even really fit in a romance plot in anyways. And he has no motivation. Like, why does... That's the other thing, especially with Aaron, but all the other... Aside from Vale, and maybe it's sort of mentioned as a throwaway for Alice and Hickory, but I think it's really thin. What motivation do any of these individuals have to win the crown? We don't really get any motivation from any of them of why they care if they win or don't. And
the only one that really seems to care is Vale.
Yeah. And everybody else is just like chilling. We're just here doing this because our parents told us to.
Right.
And it's like, especially Aaron, it's like, what in the world? Why is he even here? And the way that he's written in his dialogue and the contributions he has when the gang is all together, he's like the biggest naysayer. Like, he doesn't think anybody knows what they're talking about. He thinks all this prophecy stuff is stupid. He thinks that all this extra stuff they're trying to do is lame. Like, he's the biggest, like, negative Nancy in the story. And it's like, we're trying to, like, leave them alone. Like, we're trying to have a good time over here, and he's like, you guys are boring me. And it's like, how are we even supposed to like you? Like, you're unlikable, except that you just, for some reason, can't keep your hands off of Quinn, metaphorically speaking. Like, you can't keep away from her and leave her alone. You're just following her around like a little puppy dog and insisting you get involved in everything she does for no reason. Like, we don't even think, like, I mean, at least tie something into, like, your brother and I were really, really close, and I promised him that, like, if anything ever happened to him, I'd find you and look after you because you're a pirate and you're on the ocean and my people are from the ocean. And so we met, and, like, I mean, give him something. Give him some motivation that he, like, why he should even care about Quinn at all. And we don't get any of that. And I just wrote a motivation in 2 seconds off the cuff, and I feel like that would have made him more interesting than what we got. And I'm not a huge romance fan anyways. I do, I have a soft spot in me somewhere, but I just think that gratuitous romance just for the sake of getting a reader to have a love interest for our protagonist is a waste of space. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with Aaron. And I think that there was some good intention along the way. But again, kind of like I said at the beginning, I feel like, and this is not to slam Brittany Wang, but I feel like what she did was she was like, I really want to write a character that's like Finnick Odair, and he was really popular. So I'm going to make a merman character that is sort of like him. And then she didn't know where else to go with it. And I think that we could have just established Aaron as his own character and saved the romance for later in the series, and it just would have felt more real than what we got. But overall, I think the characters, they start off kind of like the plot. It starts off a little messy, but by that kind of third trial, it really does seem to get better, and we have this growth, and the characters that do grow are really interesting, and we really care for them and care about them, and their dynamics with each other feel really good. But it's not like that consistently from the start. And so that's why I couldn't give it full points for credit, but I will say I really, by the end of the story, I felt way more positively about these characters than I did even halfway through. So 2 out of 3.
Okay. For me, for characters, I also gave it 2 out of 3.
What?
I know. We're closer than I expected.
We are.
So I'm going to start with the unfortunate things. I'm going to do kind of the opposite you did. I'm going to kind of talk about my unfortunate thoughts and then go into positives. So the unfortunate thing for me is Quinn and Aaron. I do like Quinn more than I like Aaron. And I don't necessarily hate Aaron, but I'll talk about why I think he is the weakest of all the characters. So the unfortunate thing for me about Quinn is that she does fall into the cookie cutter YA lead situation in a lot of ways. And a lot of that is I have pressure of expectation, so I'm going to rebel in the biggest way that I can, which is run away and become a pirate instead of being a princess, because I'm sad that I hurt my brother, kind of, is basically where it comes down to, okay?
Yeah.
And then, oh no, my brother died, so I'm gonna have a oops, I changed moment, and I need to go back because I feel compelled now to, like, go back and honor his memory. And then she gets roped into this, well, you're the princess now, but I don't want to be the princess, so I'm gonna go do this Ethodyne thing, but I really don't care to win, but I have to make it look like I care so that my dad doesn't get on my back. And then, so all of that feels a little cookie cutter of a lot of other YA leads, protagonists, is that, you know, I just want to rebel and be independent and be free from my responsibilities that I was born into. And so I'm like, okay, it's a little overdone. It's a little tired. Another thing that I think is very typical of her is the unfortunate thing where it's like, I am not like other girls and I don't wear my feelings on my sleeve, and I'm going to be purposely emotionally walled off because I don't want any friends, and I don't want that aren't my pirate crew, and I don't want a romance because boys are dumb, and like and it's I don't want to be queen because I don't want to care about people that much or have to think about, you know, all of Phelan as a whole. And so that's a little, I think, tired too. And while she does have some growth in that, you know, later part of the book, I think the setup is just kind of like, I've seen this before. Like, I've seen this before. You could slap this on a lot of other YA protagonists, unfortunately. So while I don't think she's bad, I think she's just too familiar. And while she may have some characteristics that are unique to her, sure, you know, I'm not a pretty girl, I'm a fighter girl, you know, and that's a little, like, we've seen that a lot, you know, and again, it's not bad, it's just we've seen this a lot.
Another thing I thought, and I forgot to say this, so I'm sorry to jump in and piggyback on that, but her become, like, when we were getting towards the end, I wrote before I knew what was going to happen that her becoming queen is not the ending that I wanted to see because it's too predictable and it's kind of boring. I think the way it was gone about was not bad. But Quinn saying that being on the sea as a pirate is quote unquote where I belong is unusual because we don't see any of that throughout the story.
Yeah, that kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier.
Yeah, and so it would have been nice to see evidence of her really feeling at home in this more pirate setting.
Yeah.
We don't get any of that.
Quinn really pines for her brother and her mother, which I think are fine character traits, but she has no pine for the sea. Like she vocalizes that she does, but not a lot of her behavior or actions or decision making reflects that is true, that she really does just want to be a pirate again. It really feels more like I don't want to be under my dad's watchful eye more than I really want to be back on the sea.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of like a disconnect there, I think.
Except for that whole scene that almost made me gag when Aaron gets the boat and they do the little, little kiss the girl moment from Little Mermaid.
But
I was like, are you kidding me?
That's a good segue into Aaron. So here's what I think the problem with Aaron is. So I've talked about this before in regards to Nancy Drew, and I hate to use this comparison. But you know how Her Interactive does Ned dirty? I feel like Aaron's kind of done dirty in that he is portrayed as this kind of like picturesque, perfect, charming, nonchalant man. And so because of that, he really doesn't serve much purpose to the majority of the plot. And he kind of just becomes this like cardboard caricature of a person instead of like an actual person. There are very few moments that's not true. One is the one that you mentioned where it's revealed that he basically had a hand in people believing Gaius was dead. And then the other one is when it's kind of like a loose lips sink ships kind of moment where he lets it split the guy. He lets it spill that Gaius is not dead.
Yeah.
And we see a clear mistake from Aaron. But aside from those moments, it's
but he doesn't make a mistake.
Well, not necessarily a mistake, but
he says he's going to do it because he's professing his love.
Right.
Her.
But what I mean is that like we don't really have many moments that's aside from just like I'm confident, I'm cool, I'm handsome, I know it. And so I'm just going to operate in that sort of vague area. And he doesn't have a lot of clear strengths. He doesn't have a lot of clear weaknesses, which if Brittany Wang had written him to have like some very obvious, other than him being maybe a little cocky at times, he doesn't have any very clear weaknesses in regards to characters or skills. Like characteristics or skills. And I think if he had a few, maybe he'd be a little more interesting. He'd have somewhere to grow maybe a little bit more. And he also really does not have much bearing on the plot at any point. He is just kind of there. And I think that it kind of feels like Aaron was created for the sole purpose of the reader's benefit and not any other character or plot's benefit. It's almost like this is the audience that I'm trying to reach, and I would wager that a lot of that audience wants their kind of little fictional crush guy, and so now I'm going to create a picturesque, perfect, smooth, suave guy for everybody to have a crush on that reads the book. And if I was 16, maybe I would. Maybe I'd be like, oh, he's just so cool and like awesome. And but now, at my age, I'm like, I wish he did something, useful to Quinn or useful to somebody else. And it's like, he really doesn't do much in regards to like helpfulness in the friend group. And I think that that's a little bit of a problem because everybody else, all the other four of them, have clear-cut moments, even if it's only when they're in their own home turf, but they have their clear-cut moments where it's like, I am the person best equipped to help us at this moment, so I'm going to do that. Aaron doesn't really have a moment like that. And I just think it unfortunately, by the end, it makes his love confession to Quinn feel so, I I don't even want to say empty, because I believe that he believes his genuineness, and I don't think he's necessarily lying.
It's just shallow.
It's a little shallow, and it's because of how he says, I love you because I know I can't make you love me, which in my grown adult head, you know what that translated as? I don't like you. I like the chase that the game of chasing you.
Yeah.
Which is a huge red flag to me. I'm sorry. And I know that's probably not the intention or I don't know if there will actually be any consequence for him saying it like that. I think people are probably like, oh, wow, that's, so unusual or whatever. But it also doesn't answer the question of why he likes her or why she likes him back.
Right.
Does she like him back because he is handsome and shows her attention and he just wears her down eventually? Because that doesn't seem super indicative to Quinn's character as a, which is a little bit. So it's like, I don't think necessarily each piece of this romance is bad, but I think it's not packaged in a way that feels like an organic building feelings for each other. There are not any really good moments of admiration for the other or friendship, like platonic friendship base. There's not a lot of that happens. They bicker all the time. There's not even any really good, just like straight up platonic friendship moments that happen. And again, no big moments of admiration for each other outside of, I think you're cute or whatever it is,
and like in the trials, the different trials, Quinn interacts with like everybody except Aaron.
Yeah, she pointedly avoids him, right, because she doesn't want to address her confusing thoughts about him or whatever. Which, like, okay, I can see a little bit of merit to, but at the same time, it zaps any potential for getting clarification for your confusing thoughts, because now you just have a confusing moment after another with him until the end, and then you're like, what, how did we get here? Right. You know what I mean? So those are the burnt for me. But what? The thumbs down for me. The burnt sound, I don't know what I'm trying to say. So let me talk about all the positives. Gaius's relationship with Quinn and Phaedon is so interesting to me because he is very clearly established as kind of like the golden child of the family. He has just as many, if not maybe more, expectations on his shoulders that Quinn does. However, he deals with them and adapts to them way better than Quinn does. And so I feel like in a way there's this interesting comparison that Quinn makes a lot. Like, I should be more like Gaius. If I was more like this, then he wouldn't have been hurt or whatever it was. That should have been me that was, training in the guard or whatever. Like, so I think that adds a layer of like complex interest to their relationship, but at the same time, it never feels like a rivalry between them because it's established very early how close they are and how genuine, like you mentioned, that bond feels between them, and that there truly is nothing but love. They may not be affectionate the way that other fairy clans in the world are, like just as a rule of, the Gwyllians or what they're called. But it's very obvious how close they are, and it's very obvious which child is their father's favorite. And while that could be a huge source of contention between Quinn and Gaius, I like that it does not become one, and it almost becomes more like I'll have your back and I will protect you from any potential like conflict between us and our father, that sort of idea. And then how Gaius's death changes Phaedon for the worse from a reader's perspective until toward the end, where we kind of see that as we get more of an understanding of Phaedon, and Quinn gets a better understanding of Phaedon, and Phaedon gets a better understanding of Quinn, how it feels like they get to come back together, almost linked with this idea of like, we have this common thread. We both miss Gaius. And like that becomes a the one common thing that they can kind of expand on. And I think that's just a really nice dynamic, like family dynamic. You know, I kind of talked about how it is tropey, and I do think that's true, but I think that the use of this trope at least has these satisfying moments where it feels like at least it's not in vain. You know what I mean? It's not like a Cinderella and her stepmother, we're just going to hate each other till the end kind of thing. So I like that. I also think Alice, Vale, and Hickory are fantastic characters. I know you said you're not really big into Hickory, and I do think he's not quite as strong as Alice and Vale. However, I want to make a small argument for him, and I think it's because he is, of the 5 of them, probably the most different in personality. And what I mean by that is he is the one that is perfectly content not stepping up if he doesn't have to. He's not necessarily afraid of stepping up, but he is totally fine letting somebody else take the lead. He is, I wouldn't really call him submissive, but he is also very content with not being confrontational or kind of stepping back in the face of conflict. And I think the other 4 of them, especially Quinn and Vale, are way more like, no, we're going to address this right now, even if it's uncomfortable. And I think that having 4 very sort of like more confident, you know, I don't want to call them tributes, but like you have these 4 characters in this group of 5 that are way more confident in stepping forward, especially if it's something that they are familiar with. And you have Hickory, who's kind of like, I'm just cool being here. And while I do think the problem that arises from that is that, kind of like you said, where you're like, the only person who seems to care about winning is Vale. And I think Hickory does suffer from that, maybe even a little more because of his personality. I think it's nice to have at least one person in this group who just really doesn't care about being like the person to say the last thing or to be the strongest in the group in whatever way. And I think that Alice is not necessarily confrontational either, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that she's mute and communicates in other ways, and not because she doesn't have something to say. But I feel like Hickory is the character who, he will have a thought, but he will not voice it if he does not think that it is important to be voiced. Whereas the other characters, especially Vale and Quinn, but Aaron too sometimes, just says whatever is on their mind. And I just think it's a nice balance to the overall dynamic of the group, and they don't all feel like type A personalities. He's just very not type A, and I think that that is maybe a detriment to him as an individual character, but when you put him in the group, I think it's a positive. So that's my argument for Hickory.
I think that's fair.
But I think that Alice and Vale are really, really interesting characters. I loved hearing more about their family histories, and understanding their families and the dynamics, and how that their history of their families really did help shape who they are. And I think that that is a really, really important thing to note as you get into the second half of the book. And the characters do feel just more realistic and more layered as you go. And I think they're learning about their family history and dynamic really, really helps in that way. And I think it's done in such a way where it doesn't feel overwhelming, especially like Alice's family, who is shown to be the biggest family of the 5 tributes. She has the largest immediate family, and I think there could be a moment there where it feels very overwhelming to meet them all, but it never does. And because her relationship with each of them feels so genuine and so natural that it just feels like it all makes sense. Like, I see now like why your priorities are the way they are, why you have such a connection with like nature and animals and those sorts of things. And the same with Vale, and you kind of talked about it a bit with her dead parent and her overly strict parent, and how her mother literally ends up being our biggest villain, which is kind of where I'll segue into next. The Queen being the villain is, I think, one of the most compelling choices that Brittany Wang made in regards to this story. I think that the reason that she is such a good villain is because she is so in control of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you see villains that have such control over every aspect and themselves, they're almost more terrifying than like violent, loud, angry villains. Because it's like, you know, a temper tantrum can only last so long, but a calculating villain who is so good at putting the mask up and has fooled the entire nation is a scarier one. Because, and as things progress, you realize by the time you get to the end that her tactic worked. And from my view, that tactic is take an inch and eventually I'll be able to take a mile. And she slowly does that. She takes an inch, you know, she poisons Quintessa. She offers this deal. It's just like one thing after another. And it's slowly revealed to you about how she has this stacked onto this, stacked onto this. And as you go down this tower that she's created, this elaborate plot, by the time you realize how deep and elaborate it is, everything else is lined up. It doesn't feel like all of a sudden the grand scheme had to be enacted like this. It's been enacted since the beginning of the book, maybe even before the beginning of the book. And I find something like that to just be really, really compelling, and does make the stakes feel really high, especially because Vale's relationship with her mother is already so complicated, and Vale does seek that validation and affirmation from her mother, and now she has a choice to make. And it's a choice that nobody would really blame her for either way she chose. So it becomes a very interesting part of Vale's character arc is like, what do I pick here? You know, do I pick what's right, or do I, you know, stay loyal to my mother? And then knowing that if she chooses this, she may have her mother on her side, but if she chooses this, now she has to put her trust in her peers. And I think that's just like a very, like, and it may sound contrived, and I don't really think it is, because I think anybody would say, you know, picking between friends and family is never an easy choice. Your want is always going to be family, even if you know it's not necessarily the right or like most beneficial choice in the end. So I just think that the weaving of that, and how it ends up affecting everybody, not just Vale, is just really, really compelling. So all of these things to say, I really think that most characters are likable, and I think that perhaps the issues that I kind of mentioned about Quinn and Aaron specifically could be adjusted in future books. I kind of hope that they are. I really wouldn't want them to feel like the same people as they are here. But all of that to say, 2 out of 3 points for characters.
Alrighty, so our next category is personal taste and preference. So as always, we are only allowed 2 points for this category. And I actually gave this 1.5 points out of 2. So for the first half of the book, I really had a tough time engaging with the story, especially Trials 1 and 2. However, I did think that things smoothed out as the book progressed, and I felt like I finished with a good setup for the rest of the series. So I ended the book satisfied, and I would definitely continue reading. The areas that I think are objectively a little rough or problematic, by the end of the story, it did not detract from my ability to enjoy it. But I wouldn't give it full points because it really did take me. I think I read the first 3 novellas, which is the intro and then the first 2 trials. And then I put the book down for a good while because I was like, I'm not really interested in continuing because it was that tough to kind of get through. It felt very, I don't really know how else to say it, but I don't want to say anything disparaging, but it just was tough for me to really get engaged, to really buy into these characters. But I really will say after that third trial or the fourth novella, by then, it really does pick up. And I really think the ending was very satisfying. And I do think that those first three like sections are necessary. So I wouldn't in any way recommend like skipping anything or, or foregoing the beginning of the book, because I do think they're necessary and the information in them is good, but it was a little tough to kind of get up to that point. So, but I did enjoy it. I would keep reading it. I do think I commend Brittany Wang for her work, and she, she self-published this book, which is a huge feat. So I'm not by any means an expert, but I have heard from authors that self-publish that it is a huge undertaking. I mean, you really are trying to put yourself out there into a market which is so overly saturated and compete with these huge publishing companies that have way more resources than you do. And so I want to commend her for the efforts that took as well. And I did enjoy it. Like, I would recommend this book to other people. I would continue reading. So not full points, but I really did by the end. I was glad that I had read it. So 1.5 out of 2.
Okay. For personal taste and preference, I also gave it 1.5 points out of 2.
Interesting.
I think it has every fantasy element that I like, at least in some way or capacity. And while I fully see the flaws, I enjoyed this so much, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the series. I don't have much else to say, but I just think that this checks off a lot of the boxes, and while it may not check them off in perfectly executed ways, the box is still checked. So while I was very objective in the categories, this is the subject to be subjective, or the category to be subjective, so I'm going to be subjective and say very little of that actually detracted from my enjoyment. So.
All right, and so our last category, and this was probably the most difficult category for me to decide how I think it should be scored. So our last category is creativity. So to a possible score of 1, I actually gave this full points for creativity, and I will explain why. Overall, I do think there are way too many derivative, predictable starting points of a plotline. However, a component of this category is something new and unpredictable. I do think the connection between the human and fairy world, although I may not be fully on board, is ambitious, creative, and a fresh take on the fantasy genre. It's very like Peter Pan plus Narnia kind of story, and I commend Brittany Wang for committing to the direction of her story and taking a risk with a serial self-published work. A for effort. I think she deserves that. I also commend her for writing a spiceless fantasy novel in an era where those are the only ones getting any buzz and press.
True.
Most authors, I would say in the past 10 years for sure, I would say since the peak of 50 Shades of Grey, I don't see any mainstream fantasy works getting credit that are not just straight adult content.
Yeah.
In a fantasy world.
Right.
And I think that many fantasy novels, although I fully admit, and I said this at the beginning in plot, I think there's a lot of derivative plot lines. However, I can't remember the last fantasy novel that I read that had this connection point between a fantasy mythical world and the real world.
Yeah.
And that is extremely ambitious. I think it's extremely unpopular because everybody wants just a Lord of the Rings copy. And I've read quite a bit of those that are just, they've taken the world of the Lord of the Rings and they've written their own characters into it, or they've taken the world of, I don't know, post-apocalyptic YA settings, and they've just written their own characters into it. And so now I feel like we're getting this kind of pendulum swing back into the fantasy genre, fairies and elves and, that era of fantasy, Game of Thrones. But nothing's getting press or being given the opportunity to be marketable that isn't just a Game of Thrones copy.
Right.
And so I really commend the author on taking that very ambitious step to, one, commit to writing a work that is not a Game of Thrones adult content novel, and a world that is trying to write a story where there is a bridge between her world that she's created and the human world. And I think that is really risky because there's a lot of people that are turned off by that because they want to just escape into this fantasy world. But I think that that's something I haven't seen in a really long time. So for that, I think that because this category is an opportunity where it's something new and predictable, and I think she's extremely creative in building her world, even though fairies are not a new concept, types of mythical creatures with, a defining character trait is not a new concept, but it wasn't a new concept when Divergent wrote it. It wasn't a new concept when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it. It's been around for a long time. So I don't think you can necessarily fault her for writing in a genre where a lot of material is already existing.
Yeah.
But I think I almost give it half a point because of the derivativeness of the plot. But that final ending where you find out her world and the human world, there's a bridge between the two, and that one has impact, they can have impact on each other, kind of like that Narnia story, or Peter Pan, how you clap and fairies, believing in fairies will keep them alive.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that that's derivative, but it really felt unique enough that I think that concept, getting to that point of the story, really kind of pushed me over to giving full points. So
I gotcha. All right, so for me, for creativity, out of 1 point, I gave this half a point. And it's for the reasons that you just mentioned. It does pull dynamics or elements from a ton of already established series. And while, like I said, it doesn't necessarily detract from my enjoyment, I do think that what is unfortunate is that the half of the elements of the book that are unique, those are the ones that are really stand out and amazing. It's the derivative points, or the points that feel like we've seen this before, that are the ones that I'm kind of like, I can take or leave. So because I think the best creations are the 100% created creations, I wanted to just go ahead and give it half credit. So,
but what if that's the point?
What do you mean?
If humans, like dreams and stuff, impact their world, what if that's the point?
That's really meta.
That all of that exists because we've created it in our world.
That would be super meta, and I'd be really surprised if that's the plot point that they're going for.
I just had that thought, and I'm just like,
it's an interesting one, but I'm not going to change my score.
No, I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying I agree, but...
All right, so what does that bring your overall score to?
So my final score is 6.5 out of 10.
Mine is also 6.5 out of 10. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think mine was going to be higher?
I did. Yeah.
I was trying to be really objective, and I think that's where a lot of it kind of went away. But yeah, I'm gonna still read it though.
Yeah.
So
the other thing I think that is tough, and this is not necessarily a reflection of my score, but I did think about it. The fact that she published each novella separately and released them separately, it's one of those moments where I wonder if looking at her work as a whole now, if she has any like self-critiques on those first 3 novellas, because I think we both kind of agree that they're probably the weakest.
Yeah.
But it's also like...
It's like, did she get better as she went? And now she's like, I wish I could have gone back and
probably.
Whatever. Yeah.
But also I read or I heard that J.R.R. Tolkien, after he wrote The Lord of the Rings, revised a part of The Hobbit so that it was connected better to Lord of the Rings. So if even like what we consider like the greats of fantasy work can have critique of their own work, I think that's you're doing okay if you have some self-critiques of your own work. So
all right, any other thoughts before we jump into lightning round?
Nope.
Okay. Favorite character?
I think like the character I like the best.
Yeah, that's what favorite means.
Well, but sometimes I think like the character I think is the best character, or versus the character that I just like the best.
I would say like the best.
Okay. Probably Alice.
Okay.
I think.
I also agree. Alice is my favorite character as well. Least favorite character.
Aaron.
Yeah. Same.
Hands down. Aaron.
All right. Or it actually might. I also got really annoyed really quick with Wit, who I know is not present for a lot of the book, but she kind of annoyed me too.
She was kind of annoying. I really liked the twist where we got to see her again at the end.
Yeah, me too.
I thought that was great.
Yeah, the plot twist was great.
The plot twist was
the character
really
is
good.
still. She's one of those characters that I liked immediately at the beginning, and then by the time she betrayed Quinn, I was like,
"You're the worst.
I hate you, and I want to punch you in the face." Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, favorite section of the 6?
Like, of the, like, novellas?
Yeah.
That's tough. I think it would either be the Dryad trial, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the last one, the very last one.
The Gwillian trial.
Yeah, both of those I really enjoyed.
I actually think my favorite section is the Kobold trial.
Really?
Yeah, because I think it's the most different environment of any of them. And so I think that added a layer of like tension to the trial, which was already pretty intense. So I would say the Kobold trial is probably my favorite section.
Yeah.
Okay. If you were, there's 2 ways to interpret this. Okay. If you were one of the 5 types of fairy, which do you want to be? That's the first way to interpret this. Or which do you think you'd be? That's the second way to interpret.
Which one would I fit?
Yeah.
Like the most?
Yeah. Which do you want to be, but which do you think you'd be?
I think I would naturally fit. That's tough. That's tough because I feel like people could like peg me for like a different one. I think I would naturally probably fit in I would initially say I think I would fit in the Gwillian, but I also think as I've gotten older, like maybe the Sylph because of the knowledge part. So that's tough. I think like if you asked me like when I was of the age of this demographic, I would say the Gwillian. But I think as I've gotten older, maybe the Sylph fairies. So I don't know. If I had to pick, that'd be tough.
Well, you could say one is the want to be and one is the think you'd be.
I don't think either are the want to be though.
Oh,
I think I would want to be in the Dryads.
Oh, okay,
I think they've got the coolest like abilities and stuff. So I think I would want to be with the Dryads.
Yeah. But you'd think you'd either be between Gwillian or Sylph.
Yeah. And I think it would just depend on if I was more like maybe the Sylphs. I would think at this point in my life I would fit the Sylphs more.
Okay.
Because I'm a nerd.
Okay.
And I've like learning things. Which sounds really boring. But I would knock out some Trivial Pursuit trial.
That's
like
true.
I felt like the trial was like Trivial Pursuit. And
Yeah,
I feel like I would do pretty good at that compared to like the physical strength. Because the other thing with the Gwillians is they're completely like emotionless.
Yeah.
And they think that like emotion is weakness and like magic is weakness. And I don't think I fit that aspect of it.
Right.
So I think I would say the Sylph.
Okay.
And then, but I would want to be with the Dryads because I think they're really cool. And I think all their like magic abilities and stuff are neat.
Yeah.
So
I think
I would want to be the Dryads.
Yeah.
I think I misspoke.
But you think you'd be a Sylph.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay. I think I would maybe want to be a nymph just because I think that environment is the prettiest. But I do think I would be a Sylph as well. Because catch me in the library not wanting to talk to anybody but just read my book.
Yeah.
But I do think that like living in like a really pretty like underground or like underwater like city could be really nice.
That would be pretty cool.
So
I would not want to live underground. That'd be like the worst.
I think I
would die.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody would want to be a kobold.
I think a lot of people would.
Really?
Yeah, because they have access to all the pixie dust.
I guess.
And they're like super mechanically minded.
Yeah. They may be the smartest like hands wise like
like technologically.
Technologically. All right, last question.
Okay.
If you could change one small thing to improve the book, just one small thing, what would you choose?
Small thing? I would give Aaron a reason why he likes Quinn so much. And I think my off the cuff idea is pretty good. I would just have
I was friends with Gaius, and
establish at the beginning like he and Gaius were like besties, and now he feels guilty because Gaius isn't dead, but he helped trick.
But he's got to
He's got to keep up the charade, and so he's trying to like he likes Quinn because she reminds him of Gaius, and kind of start it platonically, and then factor in that guilt, you know. And I feel like we could easily have him like trying to get closer to Quinn out of like guilt, and then also this kind of like attraction to maybe parts of their personality that's familiar to him, and then then just slowly like nudge it closer and closer to romance. I feel like that would solve everything and be really easy to clean up.
Yeah, my answer is similar, and it would be to give Aaron some distinct weaknesses that he can grow as a character through.
Maybe like his like gift, maybe he doesn't have control over it.
Yeah, instead of just refusing to use it, which I get it. Okay, cool, you're a good guy. You don't want to use your manipulation.
But like how Quinn doesn't have control.
Right.
And maybe he doesn't either. And so he has this constant does Quinn genuinely like me back or not? Because I can't control when I'm like siren talking to her or whatever. Yeah, that could be interesting. I think those two tiny little tweaks.
Clear weaknesses for him.
Yeah, I think like those two tiny little tweaks would instantly make him more interesting and more likable.
I agree. All right, any other thoughts?
Script doctors, just call us.
Any other thoughts?
No, okay. I'm good.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We hope you had a good time. We know we did.
If you're Brittany Wang, don't hate us, but we'll have you on the podcast. Your book.
Yeah.
Send us your next one. We'll read it.
Yeah. If you have an idea of what we should review next, you can leave us a comment or use our suggestion box on our website, which is lionandmousepodcast.com. On our website, you can also find links to show notes, Patreon, socials, those sorts of things. Please review this episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, do all the YouTube-y things, like, comment, and subscribe. Also share our Spotify links and YouTube links with just word of mouth helps a lot too. It helps us to reach as many people as we can. We appreciate all the support. Thank you so much for listening. We will catch you in the next one.